The call at the mountain. So this account comes from a police officer who had been patrolling for years and had an interest in unusual calls. He had been dispatched to a remote mountain area late one night, and the call itself came from a woman who reported seeing several individuals on her property, allegedly holding a baby above their heads and chanting. Though the call sounded far-fetched, the officer responded, accompanied by a backup. The drive took about 20 minutes through quiet, empty roads with no signs of movement or activity, making the atmosphere especially still and pretty creepy. Upon arriving at the residence, the officer found a house surrounded by dense woods, illuminated only by two dim lights near the front door. The location itself was already pretty sketchy since no one typically roamed these parts, especially not at night. As the officer knocked on the door, they heard a noise to the left, as if someone or something large had moved nearby. Shining a flashlight in the direction of the sound revealed nothing, though the officer couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Despite this initial disturbance, the officer continued to knock and distinctly heard what sounded like a man and a woman conversing inside. However, when the door opened, the woman standing there appeared terrified and was alone. She urged the officer to come inside quickly and shut the door behind them. She then led the officer to the living room where low-quality security monitor displayed a live feed of the front door and patio where the officer had just been standing. The feed was quiet as the officer glanced at it and the woman began explaining her experience. However, the officer interrupted, asking where the man was, as they had clearly heard a male voice earlier. The woman seemed confused, insisting that she was alone. Despite the officer's repeated questioning, no one else was found inside the house when checked by the backup officer. The officer remained puzzled, knowing for certain that a male voice had been present. The woman's account explained that she had been reading on the couch when she heard something on the security camera feed. Looking at the monitor, she saw two figures standing on her patio. She heard a knock on the door and immediately called the police. As she described her experience, the audio on the monitor, which had been silent, suddenly became extremely loud, startling everyone in the room. The noise wasn't normal. It sounded like wind, but the night outside was completely calm. The officer asked the woman what the sound was, and she replied, "It's them," implying that the figures she had seen were responsible. The woman then handed her cell phone to the officer, showing pictures she had taken of the monitor. Most of the images were of poor quality, but upon further examination, the officer found what looked like two tall, dark figures standing at the front door. One figure appeared to be holding something in its hands. Unlike the live video feed, the figures in the photos were shadowy and featureless, which made the scene all the more weird. The officer continued scrolling through the images, seeing one where the figure was raising something above its head, while another image showed the object placed at the base of the door, with both figures standing near it. Despite efforts to rationalize what they were seeing, the images clearly depicted something beyond ordinary explanation. The officers then went outside to check the property, venturing as far as the tree line. During their investigation, the first officer brought up the earlier sound and the male voice that they had heard. But what was weird was the backup officer insisted that they stop talking about it. The tension between the two officers was really there as they continued their search, finding no physical evidence of anyone having been there. Returning to the woman, she informed the officers that she planned to drive into town and stay at a hotel for the night, as she was too frightened to remain in the house. The encounter left everyone uneasy. As the officers walked back into their cars, the backup officer quickly got into the patrol car and drove away without a word. The first officer, though attempting to laugh off the situation, couldn't shake the discomfort of the night's events as they left the property. The final visit. A deputy sheriff was working in a small rural town about 20 minutes outside the main city when he was dispatched to a traffic accident at around 1:30 a.m. The call reported a vehicle overturned in a canal. Upon arriving at the scene alongside the California Highway Patrol, or CHP, they found the car resting on its roof in an empty canal, but there were no signs of a driver or any passengers nearby. At first glance, they figured whoever had been in the car had likely fled the scene after the accident, but when they got closer to the wreckage, something didn't add up, being that the floor of the canal was muddy and there were no footprints leading away from the vehicle. Determined to make sure no one had been ejected from the car, they lit up the canal and split up, each officer walking along opposite sides, scanning for any sign of the driver. They were about ready to call off the search. That's when the deputy had a thought and called over the CHP officer, asking if it was possible that the body might still be under the car. With his flashlight aimed down, the beam caught the soles of a pair of shoes sticking out from under the vehicle. The body of a man lay partially buried in mud, concealed except for the bottom of his shoes, which had somehow remained clean. If it hadn't been for those soles, they might never have found him. As a sheriff coroner, it fell on the deputy to notify the man's next of kin. After locating an old address for the deceased, he made his way to a cluster of trailers around 3:30 a.m. None of the trailers had visible address numbers, so he began searching for any clue that might help him identify where the man had lived. Eventually, he spotted a car with temporary plates parked next to one of the trailers. He walked over to the vehicle, planning to run the VIN, when a voice suddenly broke the stillness. "I've been waiting for you." Startled, the deputy turned and shone his flashlight toward the porch. Sitting in the dark, rocking gently in a chair, was an elderly Hispanic woman. She spoke with an eerie calmness, with her face partially obscured by the shadows. "I'm sorry," the deputy began, unsure how she already knew he was there. "I'm looking for—" "I know," she interrupted. "My son died about 2 hours ago." Taken aback, the deputy confirmed the man's name and the woman nodded. He asked if anyone had been with her son at the time of the accident, but she shook her head. No, he was alone. He went to a party and had too much to drink. The deputy, still trying to piece things together, asked how she could possibly know that her son had passed before he had even arrived. Her response, though, sent a chill down his spine. At 1:30, he came to me while I was sleeping to say goodbye, and that he was sorry. He told me a young cop had found him and would be coming to visit me soon. So I got up and I've been sitting here waiting for you. The deputy stood there for a moment, completely stunned. He told her how sorry he was for her loss, but no words could erase the strange feeling of what had just transpired. The night shift at the factory. In the early 1980s, before becoming a state police officer, a man worked security on the night shift at a large, quiet factory. He wasn't really the type to buy into superstitions and would often dismiss anything supernatural with the simple, "I don't mess with that stuff." However, the story he told from his time working at the factory carried a tone of seriousness that made it hard to brush off. It wasn't the kind of story he usually shared, and the way he told it made it clear it had left a long impression on him. So yeah, into the story itself is his job was pretty solitary, and the majority of the time the factory darkened during his shift. He had a small room where he could watch TV or listen to the radio, but every hour he was required to patrol the factory. Armed with only a flashlight, he would walk through the silent rows of machinery, peeking down aisles and making sure everything was as it should be. The factory was vast and always creepy at night, but one particular night something seemed off. As he stepped out of his room for a routine patrol, he noticed something different as his eyes began to adjust to the darkness. In the main hallway, a shadow moved in a way that was hard to explain. It wasn't just a trick of the light or an odd reflection, but there was something darker than the surrounding area, and it was shifting in a way that caught his attention. He paused, letting his eyes fully adjust, but as they did, the shadow seemed to disappear. Convinced he was just imagining it, he swept the hallway with his flashlight, seeing nothing out of place. Still a bit unnerved, he continued his patrol, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching him. As he walked down the long rows of the factory, everything appeared normal, though there was still a bad atmosphere around. The dimness of the factory itself was enough to keep anyone on edge, even on a quiet night. When he finally reached the end of the rows, there was a large open area that led to the main entrance of the building. Normally, a light would illuminate the door, but that night the light was unusually dim. The faint glow cast long, indistinct shadows across the floor, and a cold sweat began to creep over him. The change in lighting felt wrong, But instead of checking it out further, he decided to turn back toward the main row and head for his room. As he made his way back, something caught his eye. Out of the corner of his vision on his right side, he saw what appeared to be a tall, cloaked figure. It was human-like in shape, but dark and indistinct, standing at the edge of the shadows. When his flashlight finally hit the figure, it became clear that this was not just his imagination. It was there, tall and motionless, with a shape that was unmistakably human, though cloaked in shadow. Despite the shock of the sight, he didn't stop or investigate further. Instead, he kept walking, keeping the figure in his peripheral vision until he reached his room. Once inside, he locked the door and stayed there until daylight, refusing to leave or even glance outside. The experience had been all too unnerving to brush off. When morning came, he left the factory and immediately called the owner to let him know that he would not be coming back. That was the last time he ever set foot in that building. Police chased Ghost Girl at junior high school. In the summer of 1993, a police officer on night patrol came across a weird situation at a local junior high school. It was around 3 a.m. and as usual, he was cruising quietly through the neighborhoods trying to catch burglars. When he reached the school, he noticed something strange though, being that a door on the west side of the cafeteria appeared slightly open. Using his binoculars, he confirmed it and called it in as a security check for a possible open door. After climbing a 6-foot fence, he walked into the school grounds and saw the cafeteria door propped open with a wooden stopper. Unsure if someone had left it that way on purpose or if it was an accident, he called for backup to help with the search of the building. Soon, 2 other officers had joined him. Together, they began checking the school, starting with the cafeteria. They moved through the hallways, cleared the gym, locker rooms, and the band hall. As they searched, they kept in contact with dispatch to see if any alarms had gone off. Dispatch said only motion had been detected in the areas they had already checked. However, while waiting in the main hallway for the school security officer to arrive, they suddenly heard footsteps echoing from the 3rd hallway on the east wing. Immediately thinking it could be a burglary, they formed up and moved down the hallway as quietly as they could, checking each door along the way. When they reached the end of the hallway, they found the exterior doors chained shut. At this point, they thought the only way out was through a window. As they scanned the area, a student desk suddenly tipped over. They proceeded to point their guns at the fallen desk and called out commands. It was then that a little girl appeared, stepping out in front of them. She was around 4'10" with blonde braids and wearing a red polka dot dress that looked like something from the past. She stood there smiling at them, completely ignoring their commands to get down. After a few seconds, she casually walked across the hall and into the classroom. The officers, shocked and determined, followed her into the classroom, giving warnings as they went in. They searched the room thoroughly, checking under desks, inside closets, and even looking at the ceiling. The windows were locked and there was no way in or out other than the door they came through. But the girl was gone. It didn't make any sense. Their colleagues outside radioed in to check in on them, and the officers inside the school shared a look of disbelief. They weren't the kind of guys to believe in ghosts, but there was no explanation for what had just happened. As they continued down the hallway, the girl reappeared. She stepped out from the same classroom, smiled again, and ran back inside. The officers, now both scared and frustrated, rushed in after her. Once again, the room was empty. As they moved back toward the main hallway, they saw a light turn on near the main office and library. Thinking the school security officer had finally arrived, they hurried toward the light, but just as quickly, it turned off again. When the security officer arrived though and let them into the building, they were ready with questions. Calmly, the guard asked, "Which one did you see, the boy or the girl?" Confused, the officers explained they had seen a little girl. The guard then told them that the school had been haunted for years. He mentioned that many staff members and students had reported seeing the girl, while a little boy ghost was often spotted in the library, sometimes appearing in the principal's office. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened there, and the officers realized they had encountered something far stranger than a burglary. In the years that followed, the officer would experience more strange encounters during his early days on the job, often in schools at night. Even though he wasn't the type to believe in ghosts, those experiences stayed with him, reminding him that not everything he came across had a clear explanation. The reanimated woman. A police officer and his partner were working the night shift in rural Illinois when they received an unusual call. It was a break-in at the local morgue, not the most common place for criminal activity. However, considering the chemicals stored there, it wasn't out of realm of possibility that drug addicts might be interested. They took the call and made their way to the morgue. When they arrived, the custodian was waiting outside, visibly shaken. He explained that while he was mopping the floors, he noticed something moving in his peripheral vision. When he looked up, he saw someone run across the hallway and disappear into a room. The problem was the lights were off while he was cleaning, so he couldn't get a clear look at who it was. Feeling vulnerable and exposed, he thought it best to call the police. At first, the officers suspected it could have been kids messing around, or maybe the custodian had seen things in the dark, but his certainty convinced them to investigate. They then entered the morgue and began calling out to anyone who might be inside. The only answer they received was the echo of their own voices. With the custodian leading the way, the officers started walking down the main corridor, checking the side rooms as they went. Each room revealed nothing unusual: labs for analysis, storage for tools, and paperwork. As they proceeded, they switched on the lights, wanting to make sure they didn't miss anything. One officer came to a dark room, fumbling the light switch. Once the room was lit, he saw it was just a waiting area for the relatives of the deceased. He quickly swept the room, checking every spot where someone could be hiding. Just as he finished, his partner's voice cut through the silence. He was shouting, "Hey, stop, turn around." Turning quickly, he saw his partner standing in the hallway with his gun drawn, pointing toward the end of the corridor. "She went around the corner," his partner explained, motioning to the left. The custodian, now standing beside them, informed the officers that the left side led to a dead end, no way out. Realizing they had the intruder cornered, the officers moved toward the end of the corridor, reassuring her that she would be safe if she surrendered. One of the officers peeked around the corner and saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway. It was too dark to see her clearly, but he could make out her long, fair hair. Trying to de-escalate the situation, he stepped forward, hoping to speak with her. But as soon as she noticed him, she quickly opened a large gray door behind her and darted through it, slamming it shut. The officer hurried to the door, only to find it locked. He then banged on the door, calling out for her to come out, but there was no response. His partner and the custodian joined him, and after hearing what happened, the custodian seemed puzzled. He explained that the door couldn't be locked from the inside. With growing unease, the custodian unlocked the door and the officers entered, weapons drawn. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing the empty room. It felt cold, even for a morgue. The space mostly just comprised of workspaces lining the walls, equipment scattered around, and two gurneys in the center. One of the gurneys was covered by a sheet, a body-shaped lump beneath it. The officers immediately suspected that the woman was hiding under the sheet, but as they approached, they began to notice a sickening stench in the air. It was the unmistakable smell of decay. Realizing something wasn't right, the officers pulled back the sheet. To their horror, underneath was the very woman they had just been chasing, a toe tag dangling from her foot. According to the tag, she had died 4 days earlier. Childish haunting. In the early 1990s, a small rural town in Nebraska was dealing with a growing number of abandoned buildings as families moved away following the decline of local industry. One of these buildings in particular had been known as a target for copper thieves, so police were instructed to keep an eye on it. One evening, a lone officer was making his rounds. The town was quiet, and he was accustomed to long, uneventful shifts. As he passed by the house in question at around 7 in the evening, everything appeared normal. The building was in bad shape with peeling paint and boarded up windows surrounded by untouched snow. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. 2 hours later, on his next pass, the officer noticed something different. The back door of the house was wide open. It hadn't been like that earlier. He immediately suspected a break-in, wondering what, if anything, was left to steal in the rundown building. As he parked and approached the house, something strange caught his attention, being there were no footprints in the snow leading to or from the door. The undisturbed snow created an odd contradiction, since someone had clearly opened the door, yet there were no signs of anyone entering or leaving. Still, the officer called in to dispatch, notifying them of the open door and requesting backup from the county sheriff. Shining his flashlight into the house, he saw the interior had been gutted over the years by various thieves, leaving debris and piles of rubber scattered across the floor. Strangely, the dust on the floor also showed no signs of anyone walking through. With no prints inside or outside, the officer began to think the wind had blown the door open. Just as he was about to secure the door, a loud thump came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of children laughing. It completely startled him. He then called out, thinking perhaps some kids had broken in to play around the house. But there was no response, just more laughter and playful sounds drifting from the upper floor. Once again, he radioed into dispatch, this time saying he thought some kids were inside. Moving carefully through the kitchen toward the living room where the stairs were, the officer checked every corner, making sure to avoid the rotting floorboards as he navigated the house. Twice more, he heard the sound of children upstairs, but still no verbal response when he called out. Despite the strange atmosphere, he wondered if maybe it was just an animal making the noises. But the laughter, it was undeniably childlike. Deciding he needed to investigate further, the officer made his way upstairs. As soon as he reached the second floor, the house went completely silent. The shift in sound from laughter to complete quiet heightened his unease. Then another thump echoed from a bedroom to his left. Bracing himself, he approached the door cautiously, peeking around the corner to check inside. The room was empty save for a pile of debris and some scattered furniture. But on top of the debris, something caught his eye, being a piece of paper. As he moved closer to inspect it, he saw it was a page torn from a children's book. What disturbed him the most, though, was the drawing on the page, being it was a child's crude sketch of a police officer. The moment he realized what he was looking at, the laughter returned. This time, it came from right behind him. Spinning around with his gun raised, the officer found himself staring at an empty room. No one was there. Rattled, he left the house immediately, radioing dispatch to report a false alarm. He refused to return to the house, and whatever happened inside that night, he didn't care to investigate further. A welfare check. One late night between 2:30 and 3 a.m., a police officer responded to a welfare check call. The caller, a neighbor of an elderly woman, had not seen her in weeks and was concerned. The officer arrived at the caller's home, curious as to why she chose such a late hour to report her concern. She explained that the woman next door, in her 90s, lived alone and hadn't been answering her door or phone. The caller had tried knocking, calling multiple times, but there was no response. By this point, the officer started thinking the worst, that the elderly woman had passed away, and given the lack of contact, it had likely been some time. The signs around the house didn't ease his suspicion. The woman's car sat unused, covered in a thick layer of dust. The mailbox overflowed with uncollected letters, and the house itself was dark with no lights on. The officer decided to investigate, starting by knocking on the side door, using his flashlight to tap loudly enough for someone with poor hearing to notice. No response came after a few minutes though. He then walked around to the backyard, checking the windows, but everything seemed undisturbed. The officer, still accompanied by the caller, was becoming more convinced that the woman had passed. The caller also mentioned that the elderly woman had no known relatives. As they made their way to the front of the house, the officer noticed the blinds were up on the front windows, and there was a faint glow from inside. Curious, he realized the windows were about 7 feet off the ground, too high to look into directly. The caller quickly ran next door and returned with a bucket for him to stand on. Climbing onto the bucket, the officer peered inside. The glow came from the television, which displayed a blue screen, bright enough that he didn't need his flashlight to see the room. He scanned the living room, looking for any signs of the woman, a body on the floor, perhaps on the couch or recliner, but everything was empty. He noticed the base of the telephone blinking red, a signal of missed calls and voicemails. Beyond the living room, there was a dark hallway, and with his flashlight, he could barely make out an open door down the corridor, but still no signs of anyone. Turning to the caller, he assured her that nothing seemed disturbed and everything looked normal inside. But when he turned back to the window, his breath caught in his chest. Standing right up against the glass, staring directly at him, was the elderly woman. Her face was inches from his. The shock was so intense that the officer physically fell backward off the bucket, hitting the ground hard. The caller rushed to help him, but he pushed her away, scrambling to his feet, desperate to see what he had just witnessed. His heart pounded as he climbed back onto the bucket, hand instinctively resting on his gun, eyes wide as he looked into the window again. Inside, the woman was now standing in the hallway, her back to him, wearing a long nightgown. Slowly, she turned her head just enough to glance at him from the corner of her eye before walking down the hallway, disappearing into the dark. Shaken, the officer stepped off the bucket. The caller, clearly confused, stood there waiting for an explanation, but all he could manage to say was, "I saw her." As the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall, the officer started walking back to his car. Before leaving, he turned to the caller and simply told her, "Don't come back here." He drove back to the police station, heart still racing, never wanting to return to the house again. The caller didn't follow up, and the next time he passed by, new tenants had already moved in. Whatever happened to the elderly woman, the officer never found out. Some things he figured were better left alone. The abandoned house. When he was just 19, a volunteer EMT received a 911 dispatch to a house that had been abandoned for over 15 years. It seemed odd to him from the start. Why would anyone be calling from a place that hadn't been lived in for so long? Police, fire, and EMS all arrived on scene, and after the police swept the house and declared it clear, he and his captain headed inside to do their own check. The house was an old farmhouse, and as they made their way to the top floor, a chill filled the room. Despite it being 80 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the room was freezing cold. Strangely, one of the windows was wide open. Feeling the cold air streaming in, he moved to shut the window. The old frame made it difficult, being it wasn't the kind of window that would open and close easily. But with some effort, he managed to slam it shut, glancing out at the fire truck and ambulance parked below in the driveway. His captain, hearing the noise, asked what it was. He explained that he'd just closed the window that had been left open, though he didn't think much of it at the time. They then continued checking the rest of the house, crawl spaces, closets, and even the basement, which itself gave off a strange, almost suffocating feel. The atmosphere was heavy with the sense that something tragic had happened there. Shackles were attached to a pillar, which they figured might have been used for farm animals during butchering, as one of the firefighters suggested. It all felt off, but nothing about it seemed inherently dangerous. So they finished their sweep and headed back outside. As they stepped out of the window, the captain looked back at the window. "I thought you closed that window," he asked. Looking up, the EMT's heart sank. The window was wide open again. He had definitely closed it, and it had taken a lot of effort. Confused but not willing to jump to conclusions, he headed back inside, expecting to find someone had snuck in. He searched the house again, but it was empty, no sign of anyone having been there. He made sure to close the window again, double checking it this time to see if maybe it was spring loaded or didn't latch properly. It was just a typical sliding window. He pulled it shut once more, then went back downstairs and outside, looking up at the house to make sure it stayed shut. This time, something different caught his eye. Standing at the window, clear as day, was a man in a plaid shirt. The man placed his hand against the window before vanishing. Startled, the EMT couldn't shake the image from his mind. The figure had been unmistakable, a white man in his late 50s with short black hair. Just as quickly as the man appeared, he was gone. At first, he tried to brush it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But the sight of the man still lingered, bothering him in quiet moments when his thoughts wandered. After all of this, he began to do some research on the property, wanting to know more about who had lived there. To his surprise, a friend revealed that his uncle had lived on that very farm his entire life and was the last person to pass away in the house. The friend's uncle had lived with his parents, both of whom had also died in the home years earlier. The EMT's curiosity deepened, so he asked his friend about the uncle, what he looked like, and how he had died. His friend's face went pale when he described the man as being in his late 50s with short black hair. The uncle had passed away from complications related to diabetes, not taking his insulin, and was found dead upstairs by his brother a few days later. From that day on, the EMT couldn't drive by the house without thinking about that night. Every morning on his way to work, he would glance up at that same window, saying a quiet prayer as he passed. The encounter, though brief, had a long-lasting impact, one that still made him wonder about the things that linger in places long after life has left. The girl in the water. On a freezing November night in rural New Hampshire, the police received a concerning call. A little girl had been seen wandering near one of the deep, dark lakes that dotted the countryside. Given the dangerously cold water, the situation was critical. A child alone by the water, especially in such conditions, was at high risk of falling into the lake and disappearing without a trace. The lakes in this region were notoriously deep, and anything or anyone that sank beneath the surface was unlikely to ever be recovered. Every available officer in the area was then dispatched to the scene, but 2 officers, both fathers themselves, were among the first to arrive. The drive out to the lake was long and dark, with the road winding through sparse forests and frozen field. The weather had been threatening snow for days, but thankfully it hadn't yet fallen. Still, the cold was there, and the landscape seemed especially desolate under the night sky. Once at the lake, the officers reported their arrival and began their search. The area was remote with very few houses, and the pitch-black darkness made the task more difficult. Regardless, they carefully made their way through the thick undergrowth and marshy terrain, knowing that time was of the essence. The thought of a child being lost in such an unforgiving environment pushed them forward. Eventually, they reached a small dirt beach, a clearing where the wind constantly moved the water, leaving the area bare of any plant life. The officers scanned the shoreline, looking for any signs of the girl. As they searched, they spoke quietly, trying to figure out what might have brought a child out here in the middle of a winter night. Oddly, there hadn't been any reports of a missing child, which only added to the mystery. Just as they were finishing their sweep of the beach, the lead officer's partner suddenly tapped him on the shoulder and pointed out toward the water. There, standing ankle deep in the icy lake, was the little girl. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white nightgown, with its hem flowing just above the water's surface. The sight sent a chill down the lead officer's spine. He would later describe how the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end the moment he saw her. The 2 officers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about the situation didn't feel right. They radioed into dispatch, reporting that they had located the girl, and then cautiously approached her. She didn't react to their movements, just standing motionless in the shallow water. The lead officer, feeling an overwhelming sense of responsibility, knelt at the water's edge, holding out his arms as if he were speaking to his own daughter. "I'm a policeman," he said gently. "Come on out of the water, honey. It's not safe in there." The girl then slowly turned to face the officers. Her eyes were vacant, distant. Still, she began to walk toward them, with her steps slow and deliberate. As she approached, another patrol car pulled up nearby and more officers arrived at the scene. They all watched as the girl came closer to the lead officer, her pale figure illuminated by the moonlight. but just as she reached the edge of the water just outside of arm's reach, she vanished, disappearing without a trace. The officers were left standing there wondering what had just happened. 4 of them had witnessed the event from different angles, yet none could explain what they had just seen. All that remained were small, wet footprints in the mud where the girl had stood moments before. Despite their efforts, there was no rational explanation for the girl's sudden disappearance. 2 years later, a similar incident occurred where a little girl in a white nightgown was seen at the same lake, only to vanish once again. The story of the girl became something of a local legend thereafter, with many speculating that her spirit now haunts the lake. No one knows why she appears or what she seeks, but her presence remains one of the most unsettling mysteries to those who have seen her. The graveyard shift. A security guard working the graveyard shift at a construction site in a metropolitan area had a creepy experience one cold November night, not long after Thanksgiving. The job itself wasn't really intense, but the site was located across the street from a police station, and his primary task was to keep an eye on things to satisfy insurance requirements and deter the rare chance that someone would attempt to steal building materials. The site had an office building under construction along with a multi-level parking structure that was still being worked on. Behind the property was a tall concrete wall, and beyond that, a busy highway ran in parallel. It was typically a quiet post, allowing plenty of downtime, and on this particular night, the guard was busy in a long session of the game Plague Incorporated, where he was wiping out the Earth's population through various scenarios. As snow began to accumulate on his car's windshield, obscuring the view, the guard was more focused on his game than his surroundings. But everything changed when his car suddenly shook violently. Startled, he immediately grabbed his nunchaku and flashlight. Though unarmed, he was a blue belt in Kung Fu, which gave him some sense of security. Expecting it to be his field supervisor playing a prank, something he often attempted but was terrible at, he jumped out of the car, ready for a confrontation. Oddly though, there was no one around. The thin layer of snow on the ground showed no footprints or tire tracks, no sign that anyone had been near his car. Just as he began to dismiss the event as some kind of environmental quirk, the shaking came again, though this time it felt more like a deep rumbling current through the ground rather than a disturbance to the car itself. Now on edge, the guard switched to the emergency scanner app on his phone, expecting to hear chatter about an earthquake or explosion. For 5 long minutes, there was nothing but radio silence. Then finally some routine updates, being a drunk driver reported on the other side of town. Nothing though could explain what he had just experienced. Deciding that sitting in the car wasn't going to help ease his nerves, he opted to start his patrol a little early. If there was something going on, he figured it would be better to see it firsthand. He then began his rounds, starting with the parking structure. There was only one accessible entrance, and he'd been parked in front of it, so he wasn't expecting to find anyone. Still, squatters were always a possibility, especially on a cold night like this. The patrol turned up nothing. No people, no strange noises. But just as he was about to head back, the rumbling returned. This time, the whole parking structure seemed to wobble. Feeling his nerves spike, the guard decided it was best to leave the garage in case something structural was about to give way. As he hurried out, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. There were a few security lights on top of the building, but one of them was obscured by construction materials. Despite this, the guard saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a man standing on the roof. At this point, his paranoia was already high, and he knew his mind could be playing tricks on him. Wanting to be sure, he returned to his car to grab his binoculars, certain that the silhouette was just a stack of materials or an odd shadow. But when he got back to his car, his heart nearly stopped. There was a clear impression in the snow on the hood, as if someone had laid across it. Even more unnerving were the 2 handprints, melted into the snow on his windshield. There were no footprints or tracks around the car, except for the ones he had made earlier. The guard instinctively pulled out his phone, only to find it dead. Before he had exited the car, the phone had been plugged in and charging. It had been at over 90% battery just minutes before. The rumbling then came again. Not willing to stick around any longer, the guard quickly checked the backseat of his car just to be sure, then drove to the far end of the site, as far away from the strange occurrences as possible. He decided that if there were squatters in the building, they could have the place for the night. In the days that followed, the guard asked one of his coworkers if they had experienced anything strange while on duty at the site, but the response was a simple shrug. The guard never got complaints from his supervisors or the foreman, and no one else reported anything unusual. Still though, he couldn't shake what happened that night, leaving him with a lot more questions than answers. The scream in the night. In rural Wyoming, where houses are often miles apart from any town or civilization, a police officer and his partner were called out late one night for a report of suspicious activity. It was around 11 p.m. and being that far out into the countryside, suspicious activity could mean anything, from a car left in an empty field to something far more unusual, like a UFO sighting. The officers didn't know what to expect, but they headed out toward the isolated property. When they arrived, the family living there told the officers they'd been hearing strange screams coming from the direction of a nearby creek. The sound had unsettled them enough to call the authorities, even though out in the wilderness, strange sounds weren't uncommon. The officers stayed on the porch with the family for a bit, listening to see if they could hear what the family had described. After a few minutes, the sound pierced the quiet night. It was a scream, unlike anything the officers had heard before. It was high-pitched, almost like a woman in distress, but with a strange tone that made it difficult to identify. The scream lasted around 10 to 15 seconds and then fell silent, only to start again after a few minutes. Both officers, experienced outdoorsmen who were familiar with the wildlife in the area, were certain no animal made that kind of sound. It was too human, yet too off-kilter to be anything they recognized. They instructed the family to stay inside the house while they went to investigate. As they set off into the darkness, their flashlights cast long shadows that twisted the pine trees around them into eerie shapes. The lead officer kept running scenarios through his mind. He considered two possibilities. Either it was some strange animal sound they hadn't encountered before, or far more concerning, it could be a woman in danger. The latter, though highly unlikely in such a remote area, was the more disturbing thought. The scream echoed through the trees twice more as they moved through the creek, but then abruptly it stopped. When they reached the creek, a small stream winding through the muddy bed, everything had gone silent. The officers called out, shouting for anyone who might be in trouble to come toward their voices, assuring that it was safe. But no one answered. The only sounds were the soft flow of the water and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. After waiting for about 10 minutes with no further noise, they began to wonder if they had scared off whatever was making the sound. Suddenly though, the scream came again, but this time it wasn't near the creek. It was coming from the direction they had just come from, back toward the patch of woods they had already passed. The officers exchanged glances, both feeling a growing unease, but they turned around and started heading back toward the house. They had barely made it halfway when the scream echoed again, this time right beside them. Startled, they spun around, casting their flashlights in all directions. But despite the proximity of the sound, there was nothing. No eyes reflecting back in the beam of their lights, no movement in the bushes, no sign of any living thing. Just silence and darkness. The officers all stood there trying to make sense of it, but the next scream came from the direction of the creek again, this time louder and longer, almost deafening. It reverberated through the woods, making their ears ring. The lead officer would later describe the scream as feeling malevolent, as though it was trying to drive them away. At that moment, both officers decided they had heard enough. The hairs on their arms and necks stood on end as they made the quick decision to retreat back to their house. Whatever it was out there, they didn't want to find out. Back at the house, they advised the family to call again if they heard anything further and wasted no time leaving the area. The lead officer later reflected on how unnaturally quiet the whole scene had been. Wyoming summers, especially near water, were usually filled with the sounds of insects and frogs. Yet that night, during the entire search, the area was as silent as a grave.